Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I never thought the day would come when my own son would lower his eyes while his wife mocked me for needing a single $100 to buy my heart medicine. That humiliation cut deeper than any illness yet. It was only the beginning. Because in silence, I still carried a past no one remembered, and when the truth surfaced, the very bank she ruled with pride collapsed under its own weight. I walked with no clear destination, the sidewalk stretching ahead like an endless ribbon of pale concrete. The traffic hummed beside me, horns blaring now and then, but the noise barely touched the place I had slipped into. My body moved because it had to, yet my mind circled around the scene inside the bank. $100, such a small request, yet it had been turned into a public spectacle. I could still feel the sting of eyes on me, the way people shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, the way David lowered his gaze instead of stepping forward. A bus roared past and I caught my reflection in its windows. An older woman, shoulders slightly hunched, clutching a worn leather purse. Once upon a time, I had been the one others came to for help, the one who kept children calm during long nights at the clinic, the one who knew how to speak softly to frightened parents. Now I was the woman people glanced at quickly, then looked away from. I turned down a quieter street lined with palm trees and low adobe walls. The sun glared off the windshields of parked cars, and I shaded my eyes with a trembling hand. My heart beat unevenly, a reminder that the prescription in my bag was useless without the cash to fill it. I tried not to think of it, tried to keep my pace steady. A memory slipped in uninvited but strong. Years ago, when David was a boy, he had run a high fever. I had carried him to the clinic myself, his small head resting against my shoulder. I remembered sitting in the waiting room whispering to him that everything would be fine, that I would never let anything hurt him. I had believed those words. I had believed he would grow up carrying them with him. The man at the bank today did not look like the boy I once comforted. The motel sign flickered ahead, though I did not head there yet. Instead, I sat on a bus bench, the metal hot through my thin skirt. My hands rested on my knees, fingers curling and uncurling, and I breathed slowly, willing the ache in my chest to subside. A teenager skated past, earbuds and oblivious to the world. I envied that kind of freedom, the ease of moving forward without a single thought of who might be watching or judging. I thought of Claire again, her laugh ringing sharp, her words crafted to wound. I wondered what gave her such power. Was it the title on her nameplate, the salary that bought her tailored suits, the belief that she had replaced me not just as David's partner in life, but as the authority in the family? My presence had become an inconvenience, my needs, something to mock rather than honor. For a moment, anger flared hot and unexpected, but it faded quickly into something quieter, heavier. Anger would not change what had happened. Anger would not pay for medicine. All I had left was silence, and silence had been my companion for too many years already. The afternoon heat pressed down harder. I stood again and began walking toward the motel, my steps slow but deliberate. Each footfall seemed to mark a kind of farewell, not just to the bank, but to the illusions I had carried. The illusion that I still held a place of respect in my son's home. The illusion that Claire might see me as more than a burden. The illusion that asking for help was still something I was allowed. By the time I reached the motel, sweat clung to the back of my neck. I pushed open the door to my room and let the stale, cool air rush out. The space was small, a single bed, a nightstand, a lamp that flickered when I turned it on. I set my purse down and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded tightly. The silence inside the room wrapped around me, but it did not soothe. Instead, it pressed against my ears a reminder of the silence David had offered in the lobby, the silence that had cut deeper than Claire's laughter. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor until the patterns in the worn carpet blurred. I whispered aloud, though no one could hear. $100. That was all. The words dissolved into the stillness. My eyes burned, but I would not cry. I had shed enough tears in my life, and I had learned that they solved nothing. I lay back, finally staring at the ceiling. The fan above spun lazily, clicking once each revolution. I told myself I would find a way that somehow the prescription would be filled before it was too late. But beneath that promise was something else, a hollow place I could not ignore. Today, I had been told not through words alone, but through laughter and silence, that I no longer mattered. The sun dipped lower, outside shadows stretching across the room, and I let my eyes close for a moment. The image of the bank returned again, the gleaming counters, the echo of heels on tile, Claire's face so perfectly composed, David's head bent away from mine. I breathed in slow and steady, holding the moment because it had marked something final. I did not yet know what would come after, only that something in me had shifted. The humiliation was carved too deep to be ignored, and though I sat alone in that small room, a quiet certainty began to form. Some wounds demanded more than silence. Some stories had not yet ended. The smell of roasted chicken drifted through the house, mingling with the faint sweetness of candles Claire had lit on the dining table. She liked to host dinners evenings where colleagues from her bank or friends from her circle would gather, glasses of wine in hand, voices rising in polite laughter. I had been asked to help in the kitchen, and I agreed without protest, though every motion carried the weight of what had happened earlier that week. I placed the platter carefully on the counter and listened to the hum of voices in the next room. Silverware clinked against porcelain, the kind of sound that should have been comforting, but instead reminded me that I was not part of that conversation. My son moved among them, his tall frame easy to spot through the frosted glass of the swinging kitchen door, pouring wine with a smile that seemed lighter than the man I had seen inside the bank lobby. Claire appeared suddenly beside me, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She adjusted a napkin in her hand, then leaned close, her perfume strong enough to make my head swim. Her voice was low and sharp, meant only for me. In this house, she said, people need to understand roles. Guests look to me as hostess as the one who keeps everything in order. It might be better if I stayed behind the scenes once the food was out. Her words were wrapped in courtesy, but the edge was unmistakable. I stood still for a moment, my hands resting on the tray. My breath caught in my chest, though I forced it steady. I nodded slightly and returned to carving the knife, pressing down through the crisp skin of the chicken. She left without waiting for a reply, her steps brisk and confident, returning to the laughter and the toasts as though nothing had been said. The door swung shut and I was alone again. My hands smelled of garlic and thyme, reminders of the work I had done for this dinner. Yet none of it belonged to me anymore. The stove that once filled Sundays with the sound of sizzling pans now carried only her choices, her control. The herbs in glass jars with neat labels lined the windowsill where my rose cuttings once stood. I wiped my palms on the towel and sat on the small stool near the pantry, my back aching with a tiredness that had less to do with age and more to do with being invisible. A shadow fell across the glass, and then the door opened. David stepped in, carrying an empty wine bottle. He looked at me as if he wanted to say something. His eyes flicked to the tray, then back to me. "Any more white wine, Mom?" he asked, his tone casual, almost apologetic. I handed him the bottle without a word. He lingered a moment, then said quietly that Claire had a lot on her plate. She was under pressure at the bank, and that tonight was her event. His voice was soft, urging me to understand. I pressed my lips together and nodded once. He waited as if expecting me to respond, but I did not. He left, closing the door gently behind him. I sat in silence for a long time, listening to the muffled laughter beyond the door, the sound of toasts being raised, the clink of crystal. It was a celebration, but not for me. My role had been carved down to serving plates and stepping aside. I traced the pattern of the towel on my lap, remembering when my home was alive with different sounds, my son's laughter as a boy, the barking of the family dog that had long since passed. Back then, I had felt needed. Now I was furniture moved around to fit someone else's picture. Later, when the guests finally left and the house had quieted, I walked into the dining room to clear the table. Half-full plates sat, abandoned napkins stained with lipstick crumbs scattered across the cloth. I gathered them carefully, stacking plates and wiping spills as I went. My movements were slow, deliberate, not out of weakness, but because each motion carried a finality. This was no longer my place. From down the hall, I heard Claire's voice again, softer now, but still tinged with amusement as she spoke on the phone. She said something about me being a cautionary tale, a reminder of what not to become. Her laugh followed that same sharp laugh from the bank, echoing through the empty house. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sting wash over me. Then I bent, picked up a broken wine glass from the floor, and carried it to the trash. By the time I returned to the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed behind me, steady and mechanical. I leaned against the counter, my fingers tracing the cool surface. The room felt foreign, like I was trespassing in a place that used to belong to me. I thought of the spare key in my bag, the small suitcase tucked away in the closet upstairs. I had packed it weeks ago, not because I knew this moment would come, but because something inside me had whispered that it would. I wiped my hands once more and walked toward the hallway. The lights in the living room were dim now, David and Claire speaking softly as they gathered the last of the glasses. I passed them without a word, the weight of their silence heavier than anything they could have said. Upstairs, I opened the closet and stared at the small bag waiting for me. My hand lingered on the zipper, but I did not move it. Not yet. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, the one I had occupied since moving into their house. The sheets smelled faintly of detergent, nothing personal, nothing warm. I folded my hands in my lap and listened to the muted sounds below, my son's voice blending with hers. It was her house, her rules, her laughter that filled the rooms. Mine was the silence, the shadow tucked away where no one noticed. The night stretched on the air, heavy and still. I lay back against the pillow, eyes open, watching the faint glow of the streetlight creep across the ceiling. In that quiet, I understood more clearly than ever before. Whatever place I had once held in this family had been erased. I was tolerated, not cherished. And though my heart ached with the weight of that knowledge, I also felt a strange calm settling in. The outlines of my path were beginning to show, though I could not yet see where they would lead. I turned to my side, pulling the blanket up against the chill of the desert night. The suitcase waited in the closet, patient and ready. I closed my eyes, knowing that soon it would not be just a symbol, but a choice I would have to make. The house that once felt like home no longer welcomed me, and in that understanding came a quiet certainty. My time here was drawing to a close. The days that followed felt heavier than the desert heat pressing down on the streets of Henderson. I walked each morning as I had always done, but my steps carried me farther than before. Past the church with its cracked white steeple where I once sang in the choir, past the small hospital where I had spent decades working as a nurse, past the pharmacy where my name was once greeted with warmth. People waved politely still, but there was a distance now, a shift I could not ignore. Perhaps it was not in them but in me the way I no longer felt rooted to anything. I paused outside the hospital gates one afternoon, listening to the faint hum of air conditioners and the squeak of gurney wheels on tile. I remembered holding frightened children's hands, steadying them with whispered reassurances, guiding nervous families through long nights. Those years had given me a sense of purpose that filled every part of me. Now I stood outside a visitor with nothing left to offer. The security guard at the door nodded politely, but I could see in his eyes he did not recognize me. To him, I was just another older woman standing still too long. When I reached the church steps, I rested there in the shade. The stone was warm under my palms. I thought of Sundays filled with hymns of neighbors greeting me by name, of casseroles shared after service. Those days were gone. The community shifting, new families moving, and old friends passing away or moving elsewhere. I was a remnant of another time, no longer central, barely noticed. The silence around me was not peaceful. It was a silence that reminded me of absence of being unnecessary. At night, the silence deepened inside David and Claire's house. The walls that had once held my laughter with him as a child now echoed with conversations that excluded me. They sat together in the living room, discussing colleagues and investments, their voices rising and falling in rhythms I no longer understood. If I tried to join Claire's polite smile, closed the door. David never said it outright, but his eyes held a request for me to keep my distance. His silence became a sharper wound than Claire's laugh had ever been. One evening I stood by the window in the guest room, looking out at the faint glow of the strip far in the distance. The suitcase I had packed weeks ago waited in the closet, quiet and patient. I thought of unzipping it, of folding in the last few things I owned, of leaving a note on the counter. My chest tightened as I considered it. Leaving would mean admitting I no longer had a place here, but staying meant dying slowly inside a house that no longer felt like mine. I lay awake that night, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. Memories crowded in. David as a boy running into my arms after school. The nights I stayed up with him when he was sick, holding cool cloths to his forehead, promising he was safe. I had believed those promises with every part of me. I had believed that love like that could not be erased. Yet now, when I needed only a sliver of that care, he gave me nothing but silence. My throat ached with the weight of it. The decision came quietly, almost without my realizing it. I rose from the bed, pulled the suitcase from the closet, and placed it on the floor. The sound of the zipper cut through the stillness. I folded my few clothes carefully, slipped in my worn wallet the bottle of pills with too few left inside, and a framed photograph of David as a child. I stared at that photo for a long moment, tracing the outline of his small smile, then laid it gently between my clothes. Downstairs, the house was dark. I left the spare key on the kitchen counter beside a note that simply read, "Thank you for letting me stay." My handwriting shook, but the words were steady. I placed the pen down, straightened the paper, and picked up my bag. The cab arrived just after dawn. The driver helped me with my suitcase, his voice kind but distant, just doing his job. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked once at the house. The curtains were drawn tight, the world inside, unaware of my leaving. I felt no urge to knock, no urge to say goodbye. Some farewells were better left unspoken. The motel room was small, its air faintly stale with disinfectant, but it was mine. A single bed, a nightstand, a lamp that flickered but held steady after a few taps. The window overlooked a used tire shop, stacks of rubber rising like small monuments. It was not beautiful, but it was a space where no one told me to hide. I unpacked slowly, setting the photograph on the nightstand, placing my folded clothes in the narrow dresser. The quiet here was different. Not the suffocating silence of Claire's house, but an emptiness that I could fill if I chose. I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed deeply, the air thin but free. That night, I lay down and listened to the hum of traffic from the boulevard. My heart still ached, the absence of my son's voice pressing hard against my chest, but beneath that ache was a strange calm. The burden of waiting for his defense, his words, his loyalty was gone. I no longer had to hope for what would not come. I closed my eyes with the weight of that knowledge. My world had become smaller, yes, but in that smallness there was also a seed of strength. The silence was mine now, not given by them, but claimed by me. And in that silence, I began to wonder what might come next. A few days passed in the motel, each one quiet, each one slow. I walked to the small post office near downtown Henderson to check the box I had kept for years, but rarely used. Dust clung to the edges of the metal door, and I almost turned away, sure there would be nothing inside. Yet when I opened it, a thick manila envelope sat wedged against the back, my name written across it in careful handwriting I recognized instantly. Lucia Grant. I carried it to a nearby coffee shop, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt espresso lingering in the air. I chose a corner table and set the envelope before me. My hands trembled slightly as I slid a finger under the seal and pulled out the contents. Inside were financial statements bound neatly together, the paper heavy, the numbers printed in bold ink. I scanned the first page, confusion giving way to disbelief. It was the Everlight Health Fund, the investment group Lucia and I had co-founded decades ago when we were both still in public health. I had nearly forgotten it, leaving the management to her when I retired. My eyes caught on the number at the bottom of the report. $1.2 billion. I blinked, read it again, then pressed the paper flat against the table to steady it. 48% of the voting shares belonged to me. The realization settled like a weight I could not quite lift. I had walked into a bank begging for $100, and all the while this fortune had sat waiting in the shadows of my neglect. There was a letter too, written in Lucia's familiar clipped style. She said it was time. The fund had matured and expanded far beyond what either of us could have predicted. I could reinvest, redirect, or even liquidate. The choice was mine alone. At the bottom, she had written a single line. When you are ready, Anna, say the word. I leaned back in the booth, the edges of the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Around me, the coffee shop bustled, waitresses refilled mugs. A couple argued quietly over a phone bill. A boy in a baseball cap scribbled homework. To them, I was just another older woman with papers spread out before her. None of them knew what those pages held. None of them knew how they had just changed everything. Memories rushed in of the early days when Lucia and I had worked long hours in clinics, organizing health fairs in school gyms, collecting donations in church basements. We never dreamed of billions. We only wanted to keep children vaccinated, to get medicine to people who could not afford it, to prove that access mattered. Somewhere along the line, Those modest grants had grown into an empire of quiet power. I thought of Claire's laugh in the bank lobby, of David's silence, of the way I had walked out into the sun feeling invisible. My chest tightened as I folded the documents back into the envelope. Invisible no longer. Not with this. That evening, I returned to the motel and spread the papers across the small desk. Each page detailed accounts, trusts, and assets spread through properties and financial institutions across Nevada and beyond. One line stopped me cold. Silvergate Bank. The very place where Claire wore her Navy suit and her title-like armor was listed among the institutions tied to our fund's allocations. Money from Everlight had been funneled there for years, camouflaged under grants for community health initiatives. I pressed a hand against my mouth, half in disbelief, half in something closer to grim understanding. She had mocked me for $100, not knowing the lifeline beneath her branch ran through my name. I stayed up late reading the desk lamp, casting a pale yellow circle over the pages. I wrote notes in the margins, questions I would need to ask Lucia, and circled names of partnerships I recognized. The numbers swam in my vision after a while, but the clarity beneath them only sharpened. This was no accident. This was the thread I had been waiting for, though I had not known it. The next morning, I called the number at the bottom of her letter. My fingers shook dialing, but when she answered, her voice was steady, just as I remembered. Still sharp, still brisk. She said she had been waiting for me. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a cafe near the university campus. I hung up and sat in silence, staring at the phone in my hand. Outside the window, the parking lot shimmered in the midday heat, tires stacked high, casting long shadows across the pavement. The world looked the same, yet it was not. My exile had been reshaped in a single envelope. That night I packed the documents into a neat folder and set it beside my suitcase. I paced the small room, my steps echoing against the thin carpet. I thought again of Claire, her laugh slicing through the bank lobby, her voice dismissing me as though I were nothing. Soon she would learn how wrong she had been, not through rage, not through shouting, but through silence, and the weight of what she had never seen coming. When I finally lay down, I kept the folder on the nightstand beside me, the photograph of David resting on top. My hand lingered there, torn between the love I still carried and the disappointment I could not erase. Tomorrow would begin something new, though I did not yet know what shape it would take. I only knew that the shadow I had been forced into no longer fit. I closed my eyes as the hum of the air conditioner filled the room, the edges of the folder pressing against my fingertips, a reminder that the past had not abandoned me after all. The motel room felt smaller that morning as I sat at the desk, the envelope open in front of me. My fingers traced the bold numbers again, the ones that declared a fortune I had abandoned. The air conditioner rattled against the wall, and the light outside carried the sharp brightness of Nevada sun. I closed my eyes, steadied my breath, and called the number at the bottom of the letter. When Lucia answered, her voice was clipped and steady, just as I remembered. We arranged to meet the next afternoon at a cafe near the University of Nevada campus. The place was crowded with students when I arrived. Their voices rose and fell in bursts of youth, their backpacks slung casually over shoulders, their eyes fixed on futures they believed belonged to them. I felt out of place until Lucia walked in, her presence cutting through the noise. She was smaller than I remembered, her hair silvered, but her eyes had not softened. She carried her folder like a weapon. She did not waste time. After we ordered coffee, she slid documents across the table, her fingers tapping the top sheet. Everlight Health Fund, she said, had grown beyond recognition. Properties, trusts, investments, all layered and interwoven. Then she pointed at one line buried in the middle of the page. Silvergate Bank, Las Vegas branch. My stomach tightened as I read it. She explained that Everlight allocations had been routed there for years under programs for community wellness and elder support. I stared at the name, hearing again the echo of Claire's laughter in that very lobby. Lucia's voice softened. She told me I had been absent, yes, but never powerless. 48% of voting shares meant that nothing significant could move without me if I chose to act. She said the board had already approved my return should I wish it, and that audits were within my right to demand. I felt the words land like stones on still water, each ripple expanding. I remembered the early years of Everlight. Folding chairs in gymnasiums, borrowed vans, long nights balancing ledgers, while children slept on cots nearby. We had never sought wealth. We sought fairness, a chance for the overlooked to be seen. Yet here it was transformed into numbers so large they hardly seemed real. And here was Claire, unaware that the ground beneath her bank rested partly on those numbers. I told Lucia I wanted an audit, not a spectacle, not revenge shouted in headlines. I wanted quiet review ledgers, examined line by line, approvals matched against outcomes. I wanted to see every program tied to seniors, every grant that touched women like me, women who had been overlooked. I wanted it all on record. Lucia nodded. She outlined the steps. I would be reinstated as chair of ethics and oversight. A compliance team would pull files, trace signatures, and confirm timestamps. Allocations could be paused pending review. Inside the banks, they would call it a system error at first, but as patterns failed to align, pressure would mount. She spoke as if she had seen it many times before, and perhaps she had. I held the pen in my hand for a long moment before signing the draft resolutions. My hand did not shake. When I set the pen down, the room seemed quieter, though the cafe was still full. Lucia folded the papers neatly, her expression unreadable but approving. She said she would begin the process that afternoon. After she left, I sat alone at the window. Outside, the campus buzzed with ordinary life, a professor marking papers, a boy skateboarding across the plaza, a girl laughing into her phone. None of them knew that inside the manila folder in my bag lay the start of something that would shake the walls of a bank not far from here. I walked back slowly, the folder pressed against my side. The heat rose off the pavement in shimmering waves. Each step felt heavier, but also more certain. For years, I had lived smaller, quieter, believing my time had passed. Now I carried proof that my time had not ended at all. Back at the motel, I spread the documents across the desk again, reading them in the yellow light of the lamp. I circled programs routed through Silvergate, marked questions in the margins, and underlined the names of community initiatives that had vanished without trace. I opened my notebook and wrote a heading on a blank page: Standards. Below it, I listed what mattered most: transparency, accountability, access for the people who needed it. The night grew deep, the sounds of traffic on the boulevard fading to a low hum. I set the pen down and touched the photograph of David on the nightstand. His young smile stared back at me, innocent of the man he had become. I wondered what he would think if he knew, if he realized his wife's empire balanced on funds tied to my name. I wondered whether he would remain silent as he had so often before, or if silence would finally crack. I turned off the lamp and lay back, the folder resting on the desk, like a promise waiting to be kept. My eyes closed slowly, and for the first time in weeks, My breathing came steady. I had chosen my path. The rest would unfold on its own, quietly but surely. Inside the branch of Silver Gate on Charleston Boulevard, the rhythm of the day began as it always did, but beneath the surface things were shifting. Claire strode through the lobby in her navy suit heels, clicking against polished tile, voice sharp as she gave quick instructions. Clients smiled, tellers nodded, and the atmosphere seemed smooth. Yet in the upstairs office, Elise Harper sat staring at her monitor with a frown she could not smooth away. She was young enough to still believe in the order of systems, but old enough to recognize when something did not fit. A series of internal flags flashed across her screen, subtle but insistent. Transfers routed through elder outreach programs were being delayed, small pauses at first, then outright rejections. Elise leaned closer, tracing the lines of data, comparing timestamps to approval codes. The more she scrolled, the tighter her chest became. She printed a page and walked into Claire's office, the paper warm in her hand. Claire glanced up from her desk, eyes cool, lips pressed in a perfect line of impatience. Elise laid the sheet down and explained what she had found, her voice quiet but steady. Claire skimmed the numbers for less than 10 seconds before waving a manicured hand. Technical error, she said, nothing unusual. These systems glitched all the time. Elise hesitated, pointing to a pattern across multiple accounts, but Claire's tone hardened. It would resolve itself. She was not to waste time chasing ghosts in code. Elise nodded and backed out, but she did not delete the file. Instead, she tucked the paper into a folder she kept at the bottom drawer of her desk, beneath training manuals no one ever checked. That evening, after the lobby closed and the last clients left, she stayed late typing notes into a hidden document. Each irregularity was logged with dates, amounts, and the exact messages displayed. She did not yet know what it meant, but something in her told her to preserve the trail. Meanwhile, inside the compliance portal, more warnings began to appear. At first, they were quiet, small red dots blinking beside routine entries. Then came the automated messages requesting reauthorization for transactions that should have been seamless. Elise watched them multiply over the week, a steady drumbeat of signals ignored by everyone except her. I did not see these moments firsthand, but I imagined them later as I pieced together what had unfolded. I pictured Elise leaning over her keyboard, her brow furrowed, her sense of loyalty pulling her in 2 directions. On one side was Claire, her boss, commanding and confident, dismissing problems with the certainty of someone who had never been challenged. On the other was Elise's own quiet instinct, the one that whispered these were not mere glitches, that the foundation beneath their work was starting to crack. One afternoon, Elise overheard Claire on the phone with the regional director. Claire's voice was sharp, insisting that delays in disbursements were only temporary. She promised full resolution by the next quarter. Elise sat frozen at her desk, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. She knew enough to realize that Claire was papering over problems she did not understand, or perhaps problems she refused to admit. Elise began keeping a small spiral notebook in her bag. During breaks, she scribbled details, sometimes in shorthand, sometimes in full sentences. She recorded client complaints that slipped through, moments when tellers whispered about upset account holders, instances where disbursement queues stalled longer than usual. She never showed it to anyone, not yet. It was her safeguard, a record she hoped she would never need, but feared she soon might. The atmosphere in the branch grew tenser. Tellers whispered about irate clients who said payments were missing. Claire dismissed them curtly, insisting they reassure customers that all was fine. Elise noticed how often Claire closed her office door, the blinds drawn, her voice low during calls. She also noticed the way Claire's fingers tapped restlessly against her desk, a rhythm that betrayed more worry than she allowed on her face. At night in my motel room, I would imagine the ripple beginning silent and almost invisible, spreading beneath the surface where few looked. My decision to authorize audits had already started to press against Silvergate's walls, though no one there knew the source. I imagined Elise sensing the shift, documenting it, becoming an unwitting witness. The first official alert arrived on a Monday morning. Elise logged in and saw a notification stamped with priority. One of the Elder Grant streams had been flagged for review by an external compliance team. She read the message twice, her pulse quickening. When she brought it to Claire, Claire's expression froze for half a second before smoothing again. She told Elise to mark it resolved and not to mention it further. Elise obeyed, but that night she copied the message into her notebook word for word. Each day that followed, more cracks appeared. Transfers bounced back, digital systems froze mid-process, and clients grew restless. Claire told staff to maintain smiles to assure everyone that upgrades were underway. But behind her polished words, Elise saw the fatigue settling in her shoulders, the way she lingered longer in her office with the door locked. I could almost hear the silence building in those rooms, the kind of silence that warns before walls collapse. Elise, in her careful way, was preserving that silence, turning it into evidence with every note she scribbled. Claire might have believed she could command reality with her confidence, but numbers were not so easily tamed. By the end of that week, Elise had filled half her notebook. Her handwriting slanted with haste, details crammed into margins. She slipped it into her purse each night, glancing over her shoulder as she left the branch. She was not ready to share it, not yet. But she was readying herself for the day when silence would no longer protect anyone. David called me on a Thursday evening, his voice quieter than usual, as if he were speaking from the far end of a long tunnel. He asked if I had time to meet for coffee the next morning, said he wanted to check on me. I agreed, though part of me already knew what the conversation would bring. The diner on Boulder Highway was nearly empty when I arrived. I slid into a booth by the window and waited with a cup of weak coffee cooling between my hands. When David walked in, he looked tired. His shirt sleeves rolled his hair a little thinner than I remembered. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He asked how I was settling into the motel, whether I was comfortable, whether I needed anything. His words felt rehearsed, as if he had been told what to say. I answered politely, but I could see the strain in his face. After a pause, he leaned closer. He said work had been rough lately, that Silvergate was facing what he called unnecessary scrutiny. He brushed it off as a routine federal review, something banks dealt with all the time. But the hesitation in his tone betrayed him. I listened without interrupting. My son had never been good at hiding unease. He fiddled with the sugar packets on the table, tearing one open without adding it to his coffee. Then he finally said it. He knew about the day at the bank. Claire had told him. He looked at me as if expecting me to defend myself, to explain. I held his gaze, waiting. He shifted uncomfortably and said maybe I was holding on too tightly to what had happened, that Claire had been under stress that day, that I should not let a simple request for $100 come between us as a family. His voice softened, almost pleading, but the words struck harder than if he had shouted. He was asking me to minimize my own humiliation, to erase it for the sake of keeping peace. I felt my chest tighten the same way it had in the bank lobby when Claire laughed. I reminded him gently that it was not just about the money, that it was about respect, about dignity, about being treated as though I still mattered. He sighed and said Claire did not mean harm, that she had the weight of an entire branch on her shoulders, that I should try to understand her position. The coffee in front of me had gone cold. I pushed it aside and folded my hands. I asked him where my position was in all of this. Where did his mother fit into the family he now lived in? His face fell, and for a moment he looked like the boy I once held when fevers broke in the middle of the night. But then the mask returned. He said things were complicated, that I was reading too much into it, that maybe with time I would see Claire differently. The words sliced through what little hope I had been holding. I realized then that David was not going to stand beside me. He had chosen his wife's comfort over my dignity, her version of the story over the truth he had witnessed with his own eyes. His silence that day in the bank had not been an accident. It had been his decision. I felt the weight of years between us, all the mornings of lunches packed, the nights of homework at the kitchen table, the Sundays of church pews and roast dinners. I thought all of that had built something unshakable. Yet here we sat, strangers across a cracked vinyl booth, speaking past one another. When the waitress came to refill his cup, I slipped a bill under the edge of the plate and stood. David looked up, startled. He asked where I was going. I told him I needed air. He reached for my hand across the table, but I pulled it back gently. I told him I loved him, always would, but that love did not mean I would pretend humiliation had not happened. He tried again, saying family was about forgiveness, about moving on. I shook my head. Family was also about protection, about standing up for one another when the world tried to erase us. And on that day in Silvergate's lobby, when Claire turned me into a spectacle for daring to ask for help, he had not stood up. He had turned away. I walked out of the diner into the bright Nevada sun. The air smelled of hot asphalt and dust. My legs felt heavier than they should, but my heart was strangely steady. Behind me, the door jingled shut, muffling whatever words David tried to call after me. Back in my motel room that night, I sat at the desk with the folder of Everlight documents spread out. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. I thought of David's eyes, the way they darted when he asked me to forget. I thought of Claire's polished laugh, dismissing me like a nuisance. And I thought of the women I had once served, women who clutched prescriptions they could not afford, women who needed someone to look them in the eye and say they mattered. The ache of losing my son's loyalty pressed hard, but beneath it grew a resolve I had not felt in years. I could not count on David to understand. I could not expect Claire to change. What I could do was move forward on my own terms. The Everlight Fund was mine to guide, mine to use as a light against the kind of shadows that had swallowed me whole in that lobby. I closed the folder and placed it on the nightstand, turning off the lamp. The room sank into darkness. The grief of the evening lingered, but it was no longer paralyzing. I had my answer. My son had chosen his path. Now I would choose mine. Monday morning broke hot and clear, the kind of desert morning that promised no relief by noon. While I sat in my motel room sipping coffee from a paper cup across town, Silvergate Bank was already unraveling. The first signs came when clients tried to make ordinary transfers, and the system bounced them back. Elise logged in at her desk, watching error messages bloom across her screen like red lights on a dashboard. She tried again and again, but the transactions refused to move. By 9:30, the lobby was crowded. A line of anxious customers pressed against the counters, their voices sharp with impatience. Some asked if their accounts had been hacked. Others demanded to know why online banking showed balances they could not touch. Elise rushed from one terminal to the next, her blouse damp at the back, whispering apologies she barely understood. She tapped her password into the system over and over, only to be met with the same frozen response. Behind the closed door of her office, Claire sat rigid at her desk, a fresh report spread before her. The numbers were impossible to deny. Over $700 million in assets tied to their branch were locked inaccessible, marked for review. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced the lines. She told herself it was a system audit, temporary, just paperwork. But deep inside she knew it was more. Voices rose outside her office. A woman shouted that she wanted her savings in cash that day. A man pounded his fist against the counter demanding answers. Claire closed her eyes, willing herself to shut out the noise, but it seeped through the walls, through the blinds, through the very air. Elise knocked on the door, hesitant but urgent. She carried a stack of printouts showing dozens of failed transactions. Claire snapped that it was nothing, that the IT team would resolve it within hours. Elise stood still, lips pressed together, then quietly asked if they should call the regional director. Claire's face hardened and she told her no. It would only cause panic. Still, panic was already spreading. Customers pulled out phones, recording videos, their voices rising in anger as tellers tried to calm them. Security guards shifted uneasily near the entrance, their radios crackling with updates. The lobby, once polished and orderly, pulsed with a restless energy. I imagined it as I sat miles away with the Everlight folder open on my desk. I pictured Claire behind her door, lips pale, hands tight around her pen. I pictured Elise bent over her monitor, whispering notes into her spiral notebook as the system froze again. And I pictured the clients, ordinary people who had trusted Silvergate with their savings, their pensions, their futures, now staring at screens that refused to release a single dollar. By 10 o'clock, the noise in the lobby had grown louder. A man shouted that his mortgage payment was due that day. A young woman near tears clutched her phone, begging someone on the other end to understand she could not pay her tuition. The tellers glanced at one another, their smiles brittle, their eyes pleading for guidance. Elise stepped into the lobby, raising her hands, asking for patience, but the words fell flat. Upstairs, Claire called the regional director at last. The call went to voicemail. She tried again, then dialed Candace, her older sister, who managed another branch. No answer. She set the phone down, pressed her palms to her eyes, and sat in silence. When she opened her eyes again, the printout on her desk stared back. 720 million frozen. She touched the number with one finger as if hoping it would vanish. Instead, it stayed black and final. By 11, the local news vans had arrived. Reporters stood outside the glass doors, cameras pointed at the restless crowd inside. Customers held papers up to the glass, shouting for answers. Elise ducked her head as she walked past, but Claire refused to step out of her office. She pulled the blinds tighter, locked the door, and sat alone in the dim light. The silence inside that office must have been suffocating. I could almost feel it from my motel room, the way it pressed in on her, louder than the shouting outside. No laughter remained, no polished confidence, only the sound of her own breathing and the echo of the very number she had dismissed me for asking. $100. The irony struck me then with a sharp clarity. She had mocked me in front of strangers for so little, and now she sat paralyzed while hundreds of millions lay beyond her reach. Not because of a system glitch, not because of bad luck, but because the truth beneath her empire was finally surfacing. By noon, Silvergate had locked its doors, citing technical issues. Guards stood at the entrance, turning customers away. Elise stayed late that night, her notebook nearly full each line, another mark against the illusion Claire had built. And Claire remained in her office, staring at numbers that would not change no matter how many times she checked them. When evening fell, the branch lights glowed dim behind the locked glass, a beacon of failure in the desert dusk. Clients drove past slowly, some honking in anger, others filming as proof. Inside, Claire sat at her desk in silence, her reflection staring back from the darkened window. I closed my own folder and leaned back, the motel room around me, quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. The silence that hung over Silvergate had reached me too, but for me, it was not suffocating. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of silence that waits, knowing the truth has already begun to speak for itself. The subpoenas came quickly, faster than most expected, and the date for a preliminary hearing was set within days. Word spread through Las Vegas like dry brush catching flame, and by the time I walked into the courthouse on Las Vegas Boulevard, the gallery was already crowded with reporters, attorneys, and a handful of curious onlookers. I chose a seat near the back, close enough to see, but far enough that no one would notice me. The courtroom itself felt heavy with air conditioning and silence. Judge Reynolds entered with the calm presence of someone who had lived through countless storms. Claire sat stiff at the defense table, her hair pulled so tightly back it seemed to strain her expression. Next to her was Candace Miller, her older sister, staring at the table as if the grain of the wood might offer an escape. The prosecutor rose and began laying out the evidence, his tone measured but relentless. He projected documents onto a screen for the room to see, loan agreements that listed interest rates climbing far higher than advertised approval forms, dated and signed at times when no one on staff was even present. He spoke of widows and retirees misled into signing terms they never fully understood, of files that showed cut-and-paste signatures of complaints filed that had been buried under form letters. I watched Claire as those pages flashed across the screen. Her face remained still, but her hands tightened around a pen until it snapped in two. The sound was small, but in that quiet room it seemed louder than it should have been. Then came Elise. She entered with her notebook clutched in both hands, shoulders squared, even though I could see the tremor in her fingers. Sworn in, she spoke softly at first, explaining how the system froze that Monday, how she ran from desk to desk while clients grew frantic. She described printing reports, bringing them to Claire, and being told not to overreact, that glitches happened. Her voice steadied as she opened the notebook and read her notes word for word, dates, times, and error messages filling the air with a kind of undeniable rhythm. The prosecutor asked if she had recordings. Elise nodded, and a small device was set on the table. A short clip played the sound, grainy but unmistakable. Claire's voice filled the room, cool and dismissive. She said older applicants were too risky, that women over 70 were not worth the trouble, that most barely remembered what they signed anyway. The words dropped like stones, heavy and final. Even the judge shifted slightly in his chair. Claire's lawyer rose quickly, questioning Elise about her motives, about why she kept notes in the first place, suggesting she wanted to hurt her boss. Elise answered each question the same way, plain and steady, saying she only wanted the truth recorded because she had seen too many things that did not sit right. She did not embellish. She did not falter. The prosecutor closed by summarizing the freeze, the $720 million locked for review, and the way those funds had been funneled into Silvergate under the guise of community programs. He spoke about the responsibility of institutions that claim to serve vulnerable populations and about the need for oversight when silence had allowed exploitation to thrive. Judge Reynolds asked a handful of questions, each precise, drawing the threads tighter. He wanted to know who approved the marketing language that promised dignity and access. He wanted to know why risk flags had been ignored and who authorized changes in lending categories that disguised predatory rates as opportunity. The answers stumbled. The silence afterward spoke louder than anything. When the ruling came, it was steady and unshaken. Licenses suspended pending full audit, production of all documents within days, restrictions on any elder-related products until compliance cleared them. The words landed like a gavel strike even before the gavel fell. Claire sat frozen. She did not look up, did not speak. Candace exhaled sharply as though something inside her had finally cracked. Elise lowered her gaze, clutching her notebook like it was both a shield and proof that she had done what she could. The judge adjourned and left the bench. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters hurried out, and the gallery emptied in murmurs. I stayed in my seat until only a few remained. Then I stood and walked slowly down the aisle, each step measured as though the room itself demanded reverence. Outside on the courthouse steps, the Nevada sun hit my face full and hot. Groups clustered together, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Reporters spoke into cameras words like fraud and exploitation carried on the breeze. I paused, letting the heat soak into my skin, letting the weight of the moment settle. This was not triumph. It was not revenge. It was the truth finally spoken aloud, not in my voice, but in the voices of documents, of witnesses, of facts that could not be laughed away. Claire had once turned my request for $100 into a spectacle. Now her silence under oath was the only sound she could make. I stepped off the courthouse stairs and joined the flow of people heading into the bright afternoon, knowing this was only the beginning of what justice required, but that the path forward was no longer hidden. The old Silvergate building stood empty for weeks, its glass doors smudged with the fingerprints of clients who had once pressed against them in anger and fear. When the lease was finally signed in my name, I walked through the lobby with Lucia beside me, our footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The counters where tellers once sat were stripped bare, the vault door ajar like a mouth that no longer had anything to guard. Dust floated in the light from high windows, and for a moment the silence felt almost reverent. Lucia carried a clipboard already scribbling plans for partitions, for classrooms, for a small kitchen where tea could be brewed and bread shared. She had always been practical, never lingering on symbolism when work needed doing, but I found myself standing still, hand resting on the counter where Claire had once leaned with that cold smile. Now it was just wood and dust. I let my palm slide across it, then pulled away. It was time to change what these walls meant. Renovations moved quickly with a small crew of volunteers and women Lucia had called from her network. Painters covered the dark corporate gray with soft green. Old fluorescent fixtures were pulled down and replaced with warmer bulbs that cast gentle light. In the corner where brochures once bragged about community uplift, we mounted a corkboard for handwritten notes and schedules. The transformation was not expensive, but it was honest, and every detail felt like a breath of air, filling a room that had been suffocating. When the first meeting was scheduled, I felt nervous in a way I had not felt even during the court hearings. We arranged folding chairs in a circle and set out coffee in mismatched mugs. By 10 o'clock, women began to arrive, some cautiously. others carrying folders of paperwork and faces drawn tight with years of frustration. They filled the chairs one by one until the room was heavy with stories waiting to be spoken. The first to stand was Marjorie Lee, a 60-year-old widow with kind eyes and hands that twisted a tissue as she spoke. She told us about sitting across from Claire years ago, believing she was signing a loan that would help repair her house after her husband's passing. She later learned the interest rate ballooned far beyond what she could ever pay, and the house she had shared with her husband was taken within 2 years. Her voice cracked, and she pressed the tissue to her mouth, but she kept speaking. She said she wanted to tell it here because she had been made to feel stupid, and she wanted to show she was not. As Marjorie's words filled the room, I looked around and saw tears tracing down faces. A woman across from her reached out, resting a hand on her arm until her own shoulders shook. Another whispered that the same thing had happened to her, that she too had signed without knowing the trap beneath. The circle became a tide of nods of sighs of truths that had been buried in silence. I spoke little that morning. I listened, letting the stories weave together into something larger than revenge, larger than justice even. This was not about punishing Claire or Silvergate anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity that had been stolen in quiet, calculated ways. Each woman who spoke lit a candle in a room that had once been nothing but cold glass and numbers. After Marjorie sat down, others followed. A retired nurse who had been told her credit was too weak to qualify for fair terms. A grandmother who had co-signed for her son only to learn the fine print gave her no protection when he defaulted. A young widow whose Social Security checks were siphoned almost entirely into repayments she had never fully understood. Every voice cracked something open. Lucia eventually stood, reminding everyone that this space was theirs, that Whitaker Commons was meant to be more than a meeting hall. It would hold classes on financial literacy, legal aid drop-ins, counseling, and workshops led by women who had walked these paths. She spoke of resilience, of building something that could not be quietly dismantled by fine print. When the meeting ended, no one rushed out. Small groups lingered in the corners, exchanging phone numbers, comparing notes. Marjorie stayed behind, helping fold chairs with a steadiness that surprised me. She smiled faintly when our eyes met, a smile tinged with exhaustion but also relief. That night, when the building was quiet again, I sat alone near the front desk with a notebook in my lap. I wrote down the names of every woman who had spoken, not as a record for anyone else, but as a reminder to myself. Each name carried weight, each voice deserved space. I thought back to the humiliation of being laughed at over $100. That wound was still there, but now it was surrounded by something larger, something that mattered beyond my own pain. I closed the notebook and walked the hall once more. The soft green walls, the corkboard with its first pinned notes, the smell of fresh paint mingling with coffee still in the air. The building no longer belonged to numbers or to silence. It belonged to women who had been overlooked and who now saw one another clearly. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cooling desert night, I felt the weight of the day settle, not as a burden, but as a kind of anchor. This was no longer about what had been taken from me. It was about what we were choosing to build together. The story of Claire's suspension traveled fast, winding its way through morning news shows, radio talk segments, and neighborhood chatter. Everywhere I went, I caught fragments her name paired with words like fraud, elder, exploitation, and breach of trust. I did not clip the articles or watch the interviews. It was enough to hear the tone in people's voices when they spoke. Shock, disbelief, sometimes a smug kind of satisfaction. None of it surprised me. At Whitaker Commons, life went on with a rhythm that was steadier than the noise outside. Volunteers unlocked the doors at 8, coffee brewed by 8:15, and by 9 the first women were arriving carrying folders, notebooks, or sometimes only themselves. The rooms filled with talk and learning and laughter that rose like steam. I found myself walking slower through the halls, listening, letting the sound of healing replace the silence that had ruled too long. David showed up one Wednesday afternoon. I knew it was him before I saw him. A certain hesitation in the way the lobby door opened, not like a visitor, but like someone who wasn't sure if he was welcome. He wore a suit, but it looked tired, creased at the elbows. When he spotted me by the office door, he lifted a hand half-heartedly. We sat across from each other at the small desk I used to review applications. He began with questions how the programs were running, whether I needed more volunteers, whether I was managing the workload. I answered simply. Then his voice cracked just once and he shifted. He said he was sorry. Sorry for standing silent at the bank. Sorry for letting Claire's voice carry while mine was left unheard. Sorry for pretending neutrality was a kind of fairness when really it was cowardice. He told me he had seen the hearing, had watched Elise speak, had listened to the recording played in court, and that it broke something in him. I listened, my hands folded in my lap. When he finished, his shoulders slumped forward, his gaze fixed on the floor. I told him I heard him. I told him I believed he meant the words. But I also told him an apology does not erase a wound, it only admits it exists. He nodded, blinking hard. Before leaving, he said he still loved me. I said I knew. That was all. He left quietly, and the building seemed to sigh after the door closed. On Fridays, Elise now led a class titled Financial Self-Defense. The name alone drew women who had never trusted a classroom setting before. She stood at the front with a whiteboard, no nonsense, just steps to follow. She explained loan terms, predatory clauses, and the power of asking questions. She had volunteers practice saying simple refusals. I need time to review this. I will bring someone with me. I cannot agree until I understand. The room filled with laughter at first, but then the laughter turned into determination. Women leaned forward, taking notes, furiously practicing their sentences like they were rehearsing for battle. I sat in the back during one session watching their faces. Some looked fierce, others fragile, but every one of them was taking something new into their possession. Elise carried herself with calm authority. Once, when a woman stumbled through her refusal line, Elise smiled gently and said, "Try again, slower this time." The woman tried again, and this time her voice was steady. Applause broke out across the room. That sound was worth more than any verdict a judge could deliver. It was late in the afternoon when she came. The last of the women had just left, the smell of coffee still faint in the air, and I was gathering stray papers from the front desk. The door opened and a woman stepped in slowly, almost cautiously. Jeans, a plain sweater, no makeup. Her hair pulled back without polish. She looked smaller somehow, the edge gone from her shoulders. My breath caught before I even realized it was Claire. She didn't see me right away. Her eyes roamed the lobby, taking in the corkboard covered in class schedules, the shelf stacked with notebooks labeled free to take, the soft green walls. She stopped in front of the words painted carefully above the bulletin board, financial renewal. Her gaze lingered there long enough for the quiet to thicken around her. Teresa, a volunteer, greeted her with the same warmth she gave everyone. Claire's reply was quiet, nearly a whisper. She asked for a schedule. Teresa handed her one and pointed out the classes. Claire studied the paper as if it were a lifeline. She nodded, thanked her softly, and moved toward the corkboard to read the flyers in silence. From the doorway of the office, I watched. My instinct was not anger, not triumph. It was caution mixed with something I could not name. I felt no desire to step forward and confront her. Words had failed us enough. What mattered now was space, the kind that allowed a person to choose what they would carry next. Claire's hand brushed over the flyer for Elise's class. I saw her lips move as if repeating the title. She looked toward the classroom door where only minutes earlier women had sat rehearsing their refusals. She stood still, shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but in surrender to the weight she carried. Then she turned slightly and her eyes found me across the room. We stood like that, watching each other. No accusation, no apology spoken. Just a thin recognition of the distance between who we had been and who we were now. I inclined my head. She did the same. It was all the exchange demanded. Teresa asked if she wanted to register for a class. Claire answered that she would like to attend on Fridays if there was space. Teresa assured her there always was. Claire folded the schedule, neatly tucked it into her bag, and headed for the door. At the threshold, she paused, glancing once more at the words, "financial renewal." Her mouth tightened slightly, as if she was testing what renewal might mean for her. Then she walked out into the cooling evening. I stayed where I was, the paper stack untouched in my hands. The air in the room was heavy but not suffocating. Volunteers moved quietly in the background, cleaning mugs, arranging chairs. I thought of how far this place had come from a hollowed-out bank lobby to a haven where even someone like Claire could enter without being turned away. It struck me that silence was no longer emptiness here. It was strength, the kind that does not demand attention, but holds steady until others feel safe enough to join it. I placed the papers on the counter and reached for a notebook from the stack. On its cover, I wrote 4 simple words. Not all change is loud. Then I set it back down, ready for whoever might need it next. Outside, a bus pulled away from the curb, the sound fading until all that remained was the steady hum of a building learning to live again. 6 months slipped by in a rhythm that felt both steady and astonishing. Each morning I arrived early, long before the first voices filled the halls of Whitaker Commons. The building, once cold marble and hushed transactions, had transformed into something warm and breathing. Women lined up at the door with notebooks tucked under their arms, some laughing with familiarity, some nervous like it was their first day of school. We had graduates now, women who had finished the resilience program and returned to teach new sessions. Their faces glowed with a quiet pride I recognized from my own younger days, the pride of standing on ground no one thought you could claim. The courtyard out back was no longer bare. A few of the women had planted small flower beds, and by late spring tulips stood in clusters of yellow and red bright against the Nevada dust. On warm days, chairs spilled outside, forming circles of conversation over steaming cups of coffee. I often sat on the porch with my own cup of tea, watching the way these women leaned toward each other, shoulders touching, laughter floating upward like the sound of something repaired. Claire came back more than once. She arrived without announcement, slipped into Elise's classes, sat near the back, and listened. No jewelry, no tailored suits, just plain clothes that carried none of the sharp edges she once displayed. Some women whispered when they recognized her, but Elise set the tone, reminding everyone this place was built for repair, not punishment. In time, Claire blended into the fabric of the room. She asked questions, took notes, and once even offered to help tidy up after class. I did not approach her. From a distance I saw enough. Change was hers to carry, not mine to demand. David visited occasionally too, though less often. He still spoke with that careful tone as if each word balanced on thin ice. I kept my responses simple. I did not shut the door, but I did not swing it wide open either. We found a space between us that was not the closeness of old, but not absence either. Perhaps one day it would shift again. Perhaps not. I had learned not all wounds heal into what they once were. Sometimes they simply close, leaving scars that remind you to move differently. The women of Whitaker Commons became my new family. Marjorie, the widow, who once cried through her story of being forced into a loan she never understood, now led the Wednesday support group. She spoke with a strength that steadied others, her voice clear, even when the memories trembled. A younger woman named Tasha, only in her 40s, but already carrying the weight of betrayal by her own brother over a deed, stood taller with every workshop. She told me once that for the first time in years, she did not feel invisible. Those words stayed with me. Graduation days were simple. Folding chairs set in neat rows, a table with coffee and a sheet cake donated by a local bakery, and certificates printed with careful lettering. Women stood at the front one by one, sharing what they had learned. Some spoke only a sentence, others told long stories. Every word mattered. The first time I heard someone say, "I am not afraid to walk into a bank anymore," I felt tears prick my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the release of something long buried. Life outside Whitaker Commons went on. News cycles shifted, scandals replaced by new ones' names forgotten in the churn. But here in this repurposed building on a side street of Las Vegas, the impact endured. Each class, each shared story, each notebook filled with handwriting was proof that silence, when chosen with care, could echo louder than any public speech. I often thought back to that afternoon in the bank lobby, the sharp laugh that cut through me when I asked for a single $100. I could still feel the burn of shame, the weight of strangers' stares. But when I compared it to the sound of women in this space learning, laughing, claiming their voices again, the memory shifted. It no longer held power over me. It had been transformed into the seed of all this. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the courtyard in gold, I sat outside with my cup of ginger tea. The women were inside finishing a session, their voices rising and falling in unison, a kind of music that filled the air. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. I did not think of revenge anymore. I did not think of humiliation. What I felt was a deep, steady peace. I had not shouted. I had not fought with spectacle. I had let silence do its work, and it had been enough. The breeze carried the faint sound of Elise's laughter, steady and sure, joined by Marjorie's clear voice. The tulips swayed gently, their petals catching the light. For the first time in many years, I knew without doubt that I was exactly where I belonged. Not every story ends with applause. Not every wrong is righted in the way we expect. But if you can plant something where you were once erased, if you can leave a door open for those who need it, then you have already changed the world in the ways that matter most. And so I will leave you with a question. Have you ever been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced only to quietly reclaim your voice in a way no one expected? If you have, I invite you to share it. Because stories like these deserve to be heard, and someone out there is waiting to know they are not alone.